أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المذنوبين صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي وابن مولاي أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة يا غريب يا مظلوم يا أتشان كربلاء ما خاب من تمسك بكم والأمن من لجأ إليكم سادتي يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم والقول كالحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لقد كان في قصصهم عبرة لأولي الألباب آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. Amongst the most popular questions that individuals ask in regards to the tragedy of Karbala and the story of the events that led up to what happened to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and his family members and companions, and specifically that which transpired after the day of Ashura as well, in addition to the details of the battle on the 10th of Muharram, is exactly where did these sources come from? How do we know with such specificity, how do we know with such incredible detail that on the 10th of Muharram, for instance, that it was the left slipper of Qasim that was broken, that he bent down before the enemy came and struck his blessed head? How do we know, for instance, the words recited by Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam in a conversation between him and Lady Zainab salamullah alayha on the 10th of Muharram? How are we aware that enemy X or Y or Z was the one who committed the atrocity toward Ali al-Akbar or toward Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas or toward any of the specific companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam? 1400 years have passed, and the recollection of this tragedy all across the world, no matter what country that you go to, resembles something very, very similar. But at the same time, many people, they ask, there are also so many details that I've never heard, or that I've always heard it being reported this way, but no longer do I hear it being reported in that way. And how do we reconcile then between all of these narratives and the fact that something may never have been narrated? In other words, the story that we have when it comes toward the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, is it truly accurate? Or is it something that was seemingly exaggerated by followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam? Or on the flip side, is the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam solely narrated by the enemy because they were the only ones who lived past the 10th of Muharram? Meaning, are there parts that are missing that we have completely neglected, or maybe things that have never reached us 1400 years after the tragedy? For the sake of our conversation this evening, insha'Allah ta'ala, I want to enter into this conversation, or part one of it, in regards toward the sources around the Karbala narrative. And tomorrow, insha'Allah, tomorrow night, on the night of the 11th of Muharram, I will continue this conversation and taking a look at a couple of more details in regards toward the sources around the Karbala narrative. Because again, in order to eradicate doubt and have a sense of confidence that this particular narrative is that which we believe, and is that which truly transpired to Imam al-Hussein and his family members and his companions, it's vital that we go back and kind of take a look at the history of the way that this particular narrative was narrated within the early Muslim community. And for the sake of our conversation today, inshallah, I want to reflect upon the historical sources of the Karbala tragedy in three different dimensions. The first dimension is in terms of understanding the the different historical readings historically in regards to the narrative of Karbala. In other words, how did people analyze what happened to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam throughout early Muslim history? Secondly, specifically, who narrated what happened on the 10th of Muharram, 61 years after Hijrah, on the plains of Karbala? And thirdly, and finally, for the sake of part one of this conversation tonight, how do we navigate everything that we have in front of us, from the poetry, from the lamentation, from the different historical records? What is our responsibility as a believer in terms of taking what is in front of me and applying the lesson in my day-to-day life? Let's go ahead and take a look at sort of the first part or the first dimension of our conversation in regards toward the differing historical readings of the Karbala tragedy. What do I mean when I say the different historical readings of the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam? When you take a look again at early Islamic history, or if you take a look at history all across the world, even today within the socio-political circumstances that we are living in at this very moment in this country, in light of the oppression and systemic racism and injustices that we consistently see, we have to understand that systemic racism and injustice didn't start yesterday, nor did it start 10 years ago, nor did it start 50 years ago. It started at the inception of those who started writing the law and those who started writing a narrative of what this country was built on. Because when we're very young, we understand that this country, for instance, was built on bravery, that it was built on independence, that it was built on revolution, completely neglecting the fact that this country was built on the backs of Black slaves who were brought from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. In other words, a narrative is always going to be created by those who have the power to give or to share or to publish a narrative. In the last 4 or 5 years, since perhaps the months leading up to the 2016 presidential election, media started catching on to the stream of this idea or this notion of fake news, starting with the narratives created by our current president. And now if you go ahead and you watch CNN, or if you watch Fox News, or if you watch MSNBC, or if you watch any other conservative, for instance, news station, they're always going to, have one part of their daily conversation, especially when it comes to primetime TV, doing something that is called fact-checking. Is it really true what the president said? Is it really true what the Democrats said? And as we're getting closer and closer toward the presidential election, we see that media in this country comes on sort of 2 different dimensions. That which is the conservative media, that which is the liberal media, and of course there are those which are in the middle. But nonetheless, there's going to be a specific narrative that everyone wants their viewers to subscribe to. But now we live in a world of media. We live in a world of social media. We live in a world of networking, whereby anyone who has an idea can publish anything that they want to, whether it's true, whether it's not true. Access to information is readily available. Like we know, maybe 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, and certainly 1400 years ago, we didn't have social media. We didn't have mass media. Not everyone who had an opinion was able to share it. In fact, if someone had an opinion that went against the current mainstream, what the authorities wanted you to know, you'd be killed, you'd be imprisoned. So when we go and we take a look through this lens about what happens to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein on the 10th of Muharram, who are those who are in authority other than the Umayyads, other than Yazid bin Muawiyah? So how could one expect them to explain what they just did to the grandson of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, only 50 years after the tragedy of the passing of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Their narrative was such to state that Hussein, alayhi salatu wasalam, in their language, Hussein was a man who stood up and he rose against the leader of his time, and for that reason he was killed, because he was someone who was seeking to create fitna and fasad, to create and cause corruption within the Muslim community. You take a look But this particular narrative, of course, we know that there's no way that anyone would buy that, or would think that there's no one who would ever buy that. But when you control the media, and when you control the narrative, you see that this particular sort of viewpoint and lens carried on all the way until the classical period, until the 1100s, where many individuals across the Muslim world would subscribe to the fact that Hussein alayhi salam was truly in the wrong. Forget what happened in the 1100s. If you go online on YouTube today, you go online and you type in who killed Hussein or why was Hussein killed, you will find websites and articles and lectures dedicated even tomorrow on the day of Ashura by some individuals in the Muslim community who will claim that Hussein alayhi salam was in the wrong because he stood against Yazid in their language, radiyallahu anhu. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him again in their language. Of course, in our language, la'natullahi ta'ala alayh. So the Umayyad narrative was such that Aba Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam, grandson of the Messenger of God or not, he tried to stand against the authority of his time. He tried to create and cause bloodshed in the Muslim world. Thus, it becomes the responsibility of the authorities to kill him. And that's how they went along with their narrative. A few years later, we see the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate. At the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, we see that after they had gone through decades worth of battle and struggle and war with the Umayyads, perhaps one of the reasons or one of the perspectives that they wanted to share with their community or with the Muslim community, who again they were an authority of, was that if you stand against us, you might face the same fate as Hussein alayhi salam. And one of the things which is really, really important to note is that the sort of call of the Abbasid Caliphate was Ya li Tharat al-Hussein, Lirrida Ahl al-Bayt. They would sort of get the support of many people in the early Muslim community who loved the family of the Prophet alayhi salam, in order that they would get their support so they can wage their revolution against the Umayyads. Take a look at the scene. When Yazid commits this atrocity, that of Umar bin Sa'd and that of the Umayyads in general, of causing bloodshed leading to the martyrdom of Sayyid al-Shuhada al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, for anyone who had any semblance of intellect, they were very quick to say that truly is Yazid a man who is sort of a legitimate ruler, and they were very quick to reject him. Which is why only several years passed by before the Abbasids came and they took authority and they took power. And many of their stances was to say that we are now taking vengeance for that which happened to the grandson of the Messenger of God. Of course, they called out these slogans. In reality, they were very insincere, which is why we find that the moment that the Abbasid Caliphate took over the authority of the Muslim world, again, only decades after the period of the Umayyads, we find that their isolation and marginalization of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salatu wasalam, and the family of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon them, itself was very clear and evident. Which is why we see that the Abbasid historians, when they write the narrative of Karbala and the story of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, again, keeping in mind that this particular story and this particular anecdote was fresh in the hearts and in the minds of the contemporaries. Again, only decades passed, and again, the greatest atrocity and the greatest tragedy in human history just occurred, and many of them lived through it, many of them witnessed it, many of them had family members who were present. They started creating a narrative in order to isolate the followers of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salatu wasalam. In particular, they would call out slogans like that of the fact that the Kufans are those who were responsible for killing Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, because they called Abu Abdullah to Kufa, but in reality, what did they do? They reneged their offer. If we study the history of Kufa, for another discussion, inshallah, another day, we see that so many of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, so many of the Shia of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, many of them were killed. Many of them were imprisoned, like that of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, like that of Mitham al-Tammar, so on and so forth. And many of those were unable to leave Kufa so that they can reach Karbala to supporting Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. But because of the Abbasid animosity toward the children of Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, peace and blessings be upon them, because of how outspoken they were against the Abbasid Caliphate, they began to create this narrative to state that the Umayyads, yes, they certainly killed Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, but those who were just as responsible for shedding the blood of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein salamullah alayhi was the people of Kufa, for they are the ones who neglected their Imam. And you also find a really important statement in the work of the Tabari, the most famous historian in early Islamic history, of course. He was employed by the Abbasid government. And he states in one of his works around the life of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, remember, who was a contemporary of the Abbasid government in the early period. He states, أنه أكثر من أكل العنب فمات بفجأة. Look at the disrespect they have to Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida. This is at-Tabari, the greatest and the most well-known Muslim historian in the world. If you go ahead and you take a look and you type in Islamic history, if you study Islamic history, you have to go ahead and take a look at the early works of at-Tabari. And it's really important for us to actually go ahead and take a look to see what he said. In regards to Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, who, of course, the narrative, according to the school of Ahlul Bayt, was that the Abbasid Caliphate, they sent him grapes that were filled with poison, that he ate it and eventually was martyred by means of that particular poisoning. In the words of at-Tabari, in order to, again, create a narrative that was very different to the reality in order to defend the government that he was employed by, أنه أكثر من أكل العنب, that he ate too many grapes and he died unexpectedly, as if he had an overdose on grapes, about Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida alayhi salatu wasalam. And the third reading that we have, of course, we have the Umayyad reading, we have the Abbasid reading. And the third reading is the reading through the lens of theology, through the lens of taking a look at what we know about who Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam is. That he is the grandson of the Messenger of God sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and in his own words, that إني لا أخرج أشرا ولا بطرا ولا مفسدا ولا ظالما إنما خرجت لطلب الإصلاح بأمة جدي رسول الله. That I'm not leaving Medina, I'm not starting this uprising for any other reason other than to reconcile the affairs of the community of my grandfather, the Messenger of God sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Meaning that every footstep taken by Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam was a step closer and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, throughout history, when you take a look, you see that the reports narrated by the Umayyads and the reports narrated by the Abbasids were readily available for the sort of large Muslim community if they wanted or if they sought toward getting any information about what happened on the 10th of Muharram, or about what happened leading up to the 10th of Muharram, or about what happened after the 10th of Muharram. But when it came to the narrative of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wasalam, who was going to listen to them? They didn't have power, they didn't have authority. What they had, though, was their own communities, where these particular narratives were transmitted many a times by oral tradition, many a times transmitted by poetry. And in the later period, during the times of Imams al-Hadi, al-Askari, during the Ghaybat al-Sughra of Imam al-Mahdi, what we find is that in areas where the Shi'i community was very prominent, where they had large numbers, like that of Qom, like that of Kufa, that they were sure to write down and recollect the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam in a way because they realized about how much effort was needed in order to contain this particular story. We see today that in many parts of the world, and I'm certain, unfortunately, that tomorrow, the day after that, all across the world, where Shias gather toward commemorating the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, unfortunately, there's a high probability that they will endure some sort of hardship, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Yemen, be it in Saudi Arabia, be it in Pakistan, be it anywhere and everywhere across the world. For whatever reason, People want to gather together to recollect the tragedy of the grandson of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why does it bother you? But nonetheless, there's this war consistently taking place against followers of Ahlul Bayt, and the early Shia community had to experience the same thing. So what they did was they recognized how important it was, and they tried their best toward gathering the tragedy of our master, Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, alayhi salatu wasalam, in a way that it was distributed across the early Muslim community. And this brings me then to question number 2. And that is specifically in regards to who narrated the tragedy of Karbala. When it comes toward the tragedy of Karbala, the 10th of Muharram, the day of Ashura, like I said before in my introduction, how exactly do we know everything that happened with such detail in the way that we describe it, or in the way that we explain it? We see that if we take a look at the narrators of the tragedy of Karbala, we can break it down into a minimum of 4 groups, and as we'll see tomorrow night, it can actually be understood as far more than that. But for the sake of our discussion today, amongst the first group that narrated the events of Karbala are those who survived the battle of Karbala from the side of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. This is super important. Someone says, but I thought that everyone was killed. I thought that on the 10th of Muharram, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he was left alone. He went out, fought valiantly until he was eventually killed on the day of Ashura. So how are you telling me now that there were actually individuals who lived? History, the testimony to the fact that there were individuals who lived on the 10th of Muharram from the side of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. Let me give you a couple of examples. Example number 1 is a man by the name of Uqba ibn Sam'an. Uqba ibn Sam'an is a slave of Rabab, the wife of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, the mother of the 6-month-old who have come to recollect his tragedy tonight. What's unique about Uqba ibn Sam'an is that this particular man, who was the slave of Rabab, who was a servant of Rabab, he was with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam from the very beginning, from the day that he left Medina, or according to other reports, from the day that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam left Mecca, seeking toward going to Kufa, eventually reaching Karbala. He did not die on the 10th of Muharram, but rather he was present toward recollect the tragedy of everything that happened on the day of Ashura, and from the very beginning of the journey, meaning that he was next to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. So when Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam meets Hur, or when Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam meets Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, or when Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam meets other individuals on the path and on the journey, the sermons that Abu Abdullah al-Hussein gives in Mecca, for instance, as he's leaving and changing his intention of the performance of Hajj. This particular man, Uqba ibn Sam'an, was present the entire journey, and he narrates himself that from the day that Hussein left, I was next to him, and every word that Abu Abdullah al-Hussein uttered leading up to the 10th of Muharram, I was witness and I listened to it. Number 1, Uqba ibn Sam'an. Uqba ibn Sam'an narrates many of the narrations that we have in regards to what happens and what takes place and what transpires on the day of Ashura. Another man is an individual by the name of Al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi. He was a man who pledged allegiance to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, but he gave allegiance to Abu Abdullah with a condition. The condition that he gives is that my bay'ah to you, O Abu Abdullah, is such that if all of the other companions die, I have the opportunity to go. If we are really going to die, I can leave your allegiance. And it is said that Al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi on the 10th of Muharram, he went out and fought, did not fight completely until death. When he realized that he was alone and there were no other members from his companions, from the ashab who were present, he went to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and he said, "Oh, Abu Abdullah," he said, "do you remember that condition that I gave when I pledged allegiance to you?" Imam al-Hussein said, "Go, just go." He gets on top of a horse and he leaves. Al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi is the one who narrates the interactions and the conversations about that which takes place within the tents of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam on the night of Ashura, as we're going to narrate in a little while. Many times people say that if all of the companions died, how did they know that Habib ibn Mawahir said this to Zuhair ibn Qayn, and Nafi ibn Hilal said this to Habib, and that lady Zainab alayhi salam recited this to Abu Abd? This particular man, he was witness to it, and after he left the events on the 10th of Muharram, he narrated it to those who were seeking answers to what happened on the day of Ashura. And there were many others as well, others who were injured, but other individuals who were injured, for instance, like that of Hassan al-Muthanna. When we talk about the tragedy of Qasim alayhi salam, we say that Qasim salamullah alayhi had 3 other brothers. Imam Hassan alayhi salam, he gave 4 children on the day of Ashura. Amongst them is Abdullah, which we'll make mention of, inshaAllah ta'ala, tomorrow on the day of Ashura. But amongst them is a man by the name of Hassan. Hassan ibn al-Hassan, Hassan al-Muthanna, Hassan the second. According to some historical reports, he was married to one of the daughters of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He was married to his cousin. He's married to one of the daughters of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. He went out on the day of Ashura, he fought, he was very badly injured, and on the night of the 11th of Muharram, when the enemies committed the deeds and the atrocities that they did, they saw that Hassan al-Muthanna, he was very injured, but he was alive. So reports state in this case that one of his maternal uncles, meaning one of his mother's brothers, was actually fighting on the side of Umar ibn Sa'd. And he interceded with Umar ibn Sa'd and said, don't kill this nephew of mine. So Hassan al-Muthanna went along with the caravan of Lady Zainab and Imam Zain al-Abidin to Kufa, from Kufa to Damascus. Eventually he returned back to Medina, and from his line, the Hassani Sada came. He had many children, he traveled, and from his line, the children of Imam al-Hassan, they're still alive today. But nonetheless, what we see is that Hassan al-Muthanna was a man who narrated numerous events of that which transpired on the day of Ashura. So the first group of people, and again, there have been numerous other examples as well, we'll talk about another day, inshallah. The first group of people who narrated specifically the events around the tragedy of Karbala were those who survived the battle from the side of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam. The second group of individuals are the women and the children who come from Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wassalam. As we know that the majority of women and the majority of the children who were present with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam in Karbala, of course, they narrated the events. They lived, they returned back to Medina after undergoing all of the hardship that they did, that of Zainab, that of Rabab, that of Kulthum, that of Sukaina, and so on and so forth, who narrated the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam. In addition, we know that some of the children who were present were Imam Zain al-Abidin. Imam Zain al-Abidin wasn't a child, he was a young man. Or Imam al-Baqir salamullahi alayhi, that he was present on the 10th of Muharram. And that of course he has knowledge that is gifted to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that also he has the capacity to narrate that which we see on the 10th of Muharram. The fourth or the third group of individuals who narrate the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam are the enemy army. Many times people, they think that the only individuals who narrated the events of the day of Ashura are the enemy army. That's not true. That's not true. Of course, they played an incredibly prominent role in narrating what happened to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam and his family members and his companions. Someone says, what are you talking about? How could you trust people who committed those acts of violence against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam? How can you take their word for what actually happened on the day of Ashura? This is a super important question that I need to spend just a couple of moments in terms of answering. In historiography, specifically in understanding, religious historical texts, academics have come up with this term known as the criterion for embarrassment. You can look it up online. The criterion for embarrassment, in which they state that an account that would be typically embarrassing for someone to narrate would or should likely be accepted by anyone who is listening to it. Let me give you an example. In this country, When someone pleads the fifth, it means that they do not want to self-incriminate themselves. But if someone chooses to self-incriminate themselves, that's a big evidence against them, naturally, correct? And then Islamic law as well. In Islamic law, if you self-incriminate yourself, that's it, there's no need for a trial because you admitted to committing the crime. When someone tells you about what act that they did that would presumably be embarrassing to them, it would suffice that the general population should accept what it is that they said. Let me give you an example. If someone admits toward killing a 6-month-old infant, the son of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, if someone would admit toward killing pure individuals like that of Ali al-Akbar, like that of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, like that of Qasim ibn al-Hasan, could we accept it from them? No. Why would they admit something like that, especially when they're held to account and they're being asked, why is it that you did, or tell me what you did on that day? Because many of them, they were imprisoned by Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, for instance. Mukhtar, who tries to wage a war against those who killed Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam and his family members and his companions. When they admit what they did, again, we utilize this particular notion as the criterion for embarrassment. That someone who would admit to something that would otherwise be embarrassing should be accepted by those who are viewing them. And I will say this as well, my dear sisters and brothers. If they are the ones who are narrating so much of what they did on the 10th of Muharram, wouldn't it be likely that many of them would not narrate the story entirely or the details entirely because of their fear of being more embarrassed for what it is that they did? So what does this tell you? What does this tell you? When it comes toward the story and the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, how much do we have? How much do we have? The fourth group of individuals who narrate that which happened to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, of course, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, who by means of our ziyarat, in ziyarat al-waratha, for instance, we see these lines spoken about Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. In ziyarat al-nahiya of Imam al-Zaman, we get unique insights in regards to who Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam is. We have narrations that tell us that Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam narrates an entire maqtal that Sheikh al-Saduq, he himself narrates in one of his works, but unfortunately we don't have that in front of us today. So we see that the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, by means of their reports and by means of their ziyarat and by means of their visitations, we further get a little bit more insight in regards to what happens on the 10th of Muharram. And again, there are many other groups of individuals who also narrate, or where we also get information about what happened to Imam al-Hussein and his family members and his companions. Just one of those examples, for instance, like that of the poets. There were poets who would come in front of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salam, in front of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rada, and they would recite these lines of poetry in order to paint a picture. Of course, in poetry, we use metaphors, we speak in a high level of semantics and eloquence and so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily tell truth, but it creates a picture for the one who is listening. But nonetheless, we can take insight from that which was narrated in the presence of the Imam, because if they were lying in the presence of the Imam, then it would become the responsibility of the Imam to correct them. And because the Imam ﷺ didn't condemn, but rather he encouraged, we see that again, that this picture of the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein ﷺ is further narrated, or we take further evidence from that which was spoken by those early poets in the presence of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt ﷺ. So we go ahead and we see that all of these narrations that we have give us some sort of an insight in regards to the maqtal of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein ﷺ. But when it comes to the actual books, who are the ones who wrote them? Who are the ones who put the story of Imam al-Hussein ﷺ in a textbook, for instance, whereby we, the reader, the speaker, the khatib, has the responsibility of narrating the tragedy to the listeners? The first one of these, maqatil literature, the maqtal literature, literally is translated as the literature which recollects the tragedy, specifically when we talk about the maqtal literature, we're talking about the tragedy, of course, of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. The first one to write a maqtal of the life and the legacy and the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam was a man by the name of Asbagh ibn Nubata. Many of you might be familiar with Asbagh ibn Nubata, who was amongst the closest of companions of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib salamullah alayhi, who according to historians dies 70 years after Hijrah. When is Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam's tragedy? 61 years after Hijrah. He lives in Kufa. Many of you are familiar with the name Asbagh ibn Nubata because on the night of the 20th of Ramadan, traditionally, we narrate his story that Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, after he had taken the blow of Ibn Muljam on the 19th of the month of Ramadan, on the 20th of Ramadan, all of his companions, they come, they visit him, they bid their last farewell. And then Imam Ali alayhi salam, he looks toward Imam al-Hassan, he says, "Oh, Aba Muhammad, tell all of my companions to leave because now I want to spend time with my family." And as he is in the company of his family, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam, he hears someone crying outside the door. And Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam says, "Who is it?" So Imam al-Hassan salamullah alayhi, he goes to the door, he opens the door and he sees Asbagh, who is sitting outside of the house of Ali, crying and weeping. Imam al-Hassan says, "Oh Asbagh, is everything okay?" He says, "I need to see my master Ali one final time." He enters back into the house, he sees Imam Ali alayhi salam. You know what Imam Ali tells him? He says, "Oh Asbagh." He says, "Oh Asbagh." He said, "Don't cry, don't worry. I'm going to go and see my brother, the messenger of God, tomorrow." You know what Asbagh responds? He says, "Oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, I'm not crying for you. I'm not worried about your fate and I'm not worried about your destiny. Rather, I'm worried about me. What is life like without Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam?" This is Asbagh ibn Nubata. He is the first one to write the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. Prior to 70 years after Hijrah, he himself was in Kufa. Unfortunately, this maqtal of Asbagh ibn Nubata, we no longer have it. History is a testament to the fact that we lost so much of our literature and so much of our texts. Remember, when Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam and their followers were not in a ruling position, it became that much more difficult and challenging toward transmitting this particular narrative. Number two, the second maqtal that was written in early Islamic history is the maqtal of Jabir ibn Yazid al-Ja'fi, who some would consider to be a companion of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. Also from Kufa, Jabir ibn Yazid al-Ja'fi dies in the year 128 after Hijrah, so approximately 60 years after the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. Unfortunately, we do not have this maqtal either. Thirdly, we have a man by the name of Ammar ibn Muawiyah al-Dahani, or Muawiyah ibn Ammar al-Dahani. He dies in the year 133 after Hijrah, is a contemporary of the 6th Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, and we have some parts of his narration or of his recollection of what happened to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. Again, from what he may have heard from those individuals that we spoke about earlier. And we see that at-Tabari in his work, he narrates many a times from the words of Muawiyah ibn Ammar or Ammar ibn Muawiyah al-Juhani, that he said this about what he heard from X person about what happened on the 10th of Muharram to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, but we again do not have it in this entirety. And thirdly, or fourthly, the most important maqtal literature or piece of literature that we have is the maqtal of a man by the name of Lut ibn Yahya, or as he's famously known as the Maqtal Abi Makhnaf. Tomorrow night, inshaAllah ta'ala, I'll speak more about Maqtal Abi Makhnaf. Maqtal Abi Makhnaf is amongst the most important pieces of literature that we have when it comes toward the story and the history and the life of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. He dies in the year 157 after Hijrah. He was seemingly seen by some as an independent historian who met with many of those who directly witnessed the tragedy of Karbala, narrated from first-hand witnesses or narrated from those who were narrated by one sort of gap of those who were first-hand witnesses of the tragedy of Karbala. But what we have in terms of Maqtal Abi Nakhnaf is not complete. The majority of it is lost. And what we have today has been reconstructed by scholars and historians over the last several centuries. So again, those which are the most early sources about the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein, alayhi salatu wasalam, only a little bit has reached us today. And this brings me then to the third part of my discussion. That today we have all of these different stories. In fact, historians state that in the first 3 centuries of Islamic history, leading up to 290 years after Hijrah, we had about 30 maqtas, 30 works dedicated toward recollecting the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, and the only one that we have today is part of Maqtal Abi Nakhnaf. It's been translated in the English language as well, you can find it online. Which again, does not tell the whole story. Because again, it's parts which have been reconstructed. So now we have all of these historical reports. Many of them from an early period which have not reached us. And then we have the work of later historians who tried to recollect the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, who tried to hear what the oral tradition in the early Shia community was, have tried to reconstruct by means of the ziyarah and by means of the poetry. And we even see that today in front of us, we have many narratives that are conflicting. For instance, somebody called me today and he told me, tell me about the marriage of Qasim, that Qasim get married on the day of Ashura that many people might have heard. Take a look at this particular narrative. It's a narrative that has come out virtually recently. Talk about that another day, inshallah. But take a look at the early sources, and you don't find this present. And if we want to narrate the events of that which transpired on the 10th of Muharram, you have to have evidence for why you state that X and Y and Z happened and transpired and took place. There are those which are the more popular narrative, like the narrative that I mentioned a couple of nights ago in regards to the story of Abul Fadl Abbas. What many don't know is that an equally beautiful narration about Abul Fadl Abbas alayhi salatu wasalam is that Abul Fadl Abbas did not, according to this other historical report, that Abul Fadl Abbas alayhi salam, he did not go to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and say, oh my brother, let me take permission to go and get water. Or nor did Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam say, oh Abul Fadl Abbas, you go and bring water from the children. But rather, as narrated in the Maqtal of Sayyid ibn Tawus, al-Luhuf, he states that, for instance, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and Abul Fadl Abbas, they went out together toward the river Euphrates. Again, demonstrating the greatness of Abul Fadl Abbas alayhi salatu wasalam, that he had that close relationship with Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi, that they both went out together seeking water for the women, seeking water from the children, but the army of Amr ibn Sa'd separated them from one another. Hussein alayhi salam had to return back, but Abul Fadl Abbas alayhi salam is martyred in the way that we state. We take a look at this particular report, that particular report. Many times people, they ask, what's true? Should we just reject everything? Should we accept everything? Should we find something in between? Of course, it's the responsibility of the historian, the responsibility of the scholar, the responsibility of the one narrating the tragedy to go ahead and reconstruct the story to the best of his or her capacity and ability based on utilizing those most reliable sources in front of him or her. But it suffices for me to say this. Inshallah, we can talk more about this tomorrow night. It suffices for me to say this, my dear sisters and brothers. It is a night of Ashura, a night of incredible tragedy. And regardless of the fact that many have tried to limit the way that we recollect the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, to state that, look at all of these conflicting reports, how can you take anything about it? How can you take anything from it? It suffices for me to say that Hussein alayhi salam, as I narrated to you on the 1st of Muharram, that Hussein alayhi salam who sat in the lap of the Messenger of God sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and who was in the company of Ali and Fatima and Hassan and had the cloak on over their head, and he called out, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا, in Hadith al-Kisa, that Hussein alayhi salam, less than 50 years after the passing of his grandfather, stood alone on the 10th of Muharram. If this is not the greatest tragedy ever witnessed in human history, please bring me something more heartbreaking. Whether Abu al-Fadl Abbas went with Imam al-Hussein or whether Imam al-Hussein sent Abu al-Fadl Abbas. Whether the body of Qasim was trampled by the horses or whether Qasim alayhi salam's body was not trampled by the horses. Whether the mother of Ali al-Akbar Layla was present in Karbala or not. All of these are conversations and discussions that are presented within the books of history, debated amongst ulama for many, many decades, many, many centuries. Suffices that Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam, he stood in front of 30,000 people ready to shed his most sacred blood. And as we enter into the night of Ashura, as we recollect that tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam, my dear friends, I want you to take your heart toward Karbala. I want you to imagine what you would do under the circumstances of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, under the circumstances of the companions of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. In the afternoon on the 9th of Muharram, Yom al-Tasu'ah, the day that just passed us, Umar ibn Sa'ad started beating the drums of war and blowing the trumpets of battle. And it is said that at this moment, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he looks toward Abu al-Fadl Abbas and he says, "Oh, Abu al-Fadl Abbas, go and see what Umar ibn Sa'ad wants." Umar ibn Sa'ad intended for the day of Ashura, for the tragedy of Karbala, for the event and the battle to take place on the eve of this particular night, meaning at these hours, this is when the day of Ashura was intended to take place, Yom al-Tasu'ah, the night. And it is said that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam sends Abu al-Fadl Abbas. Abu al-Fadl Abbas goes to Umar ibn Sa'ad and he says, "What's this?" He says that we are ready to start battle. Abu al-Fadl Abbas goes to Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi and he says, "Oh, Abu Abdullah," he says that Umar ibn Sa'ad is ready to fight. Are we ready to fight? He says, "Go and tell Umar ibn Sa'ad to give us this one evening." Why? Look at your master Hussein alayhi salam. This is why we love this man. This is why we dress like this for this man. This is why we weep tears this is why we weep tears and grieve day and night for Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. You know what he said? He said, "Go to Umar ibn Sa'ad and tell him to grant us this eve لأني أحب الصلاة وقراءة القرآن." Because I want to spend this night in prayers and in a recitation of the whole Quran, and God knows that I love nothing more than doing these two things. Think about it strategically. If the battle was fought in the eve as opposed to under the sun, that would have, given a little bit more energy to the army of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. That they would have only been distanced by water for 2.5 days as opposed to 3. Yet Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam is concerned with none of those things. Because the only thing that Abu Abdullah al-Hussein sees on that eve and on that day is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لِأَنِّي أُحِبُّ الصَّلَاةِ. Abu al-Fadl Abbas goes, he tells Umar ibn Sa'ad says, "Give them whatever they want because in a few hours that battle will take place and we will shed all of their blood." And it is said that on that night of Ashura, the narrators, they narrate from the enemy of the army of Amr ibn Sa'ad, they state that we heard the buzzing of bees, the recitation of adhkar and dua and Quran coming from the tents of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And some of those within the tents, they would state that Hussein and his companions, they would be standing and bowing and prostrating the entirety of the night, looking forward to that which they are going to experience tomorrow. We mentioned a couple of days ago, of course, the story of Burair, this companion of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, who had undergone so much hardship, who had undergone so much difficulty, But on the night of Ashura, he was at peace and he was at ease and he was in a state of contentment. When some of his friends, they came up to him and they said, "Oh, Zuhair, we've never seen you with this joy. We've never seen you with this happiness." He says, "I am going to give my life in the way of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. What better honor?" And it is said that as the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam were in the course of prayers and they were in the course of worship, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he exits from the tent. And he begins to walk around and in between the tents of his companions, of his family members, and his children, his women. For those of you who have been to Karbala, اللهم رزقنا وإياكم زيارة الحسين في الدنيا والآخرة. You know the place of the location of the tents of Imam al-Hussein, the location known as the Mukhayyam. I want you to take yourself there. And the fact that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam is walking in between them. And it is said that he walks to the middle of the battlefield, looking at the army of Amr ibn Sa'ad and looking back at his own tents. Then he picks up a couple of rocks and he throws it to the side. And a few moments later, one of his companions, a man by the name of Nafi' ibn Hilal, he comes to Abu Abdullah. He says, "Oh, Abu Abdullah, what are you doing here? Everyone else is inside, everyone is praying, they're worshiping. Why do I see you walking all alone over here?" Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam says, "Oh, Nafi', rather, what are you doing out here?" He says, "Oh, Abu Abdullah, I'm just afraid that the army of Amr ibn Sa'ad might strike an arrow to you, and I'd rather take it and give my life in your way, oh Abu Abdullah." Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he looks toward Nafi' ibn Hilal, and he says, "Oh, Nafi', I'm not doing much. He says, I'm just picking up these stones and these rocks and throwing them to the side." One report states that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam was picking up those rocks and picking up those stones, perhaps because he knew what was going to happen to his women on the night of the 11th of Muharram. And he didn't want them to step on any of those sharp objects that were around on the plains and on the desert of Karbala. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he says, "Oh, Nafi'," he said, "do you see those two mountains?" And he points in the distance. He says, "Why don't you go and slip in between those two mountains and go back home to Kufa? Go back home to your family. You don't need to be here. You've been more than loyal to me." Oh, Nafi'. You know what Nafi' says? He says, "Oh, Abu Abdullah." He says, "May the wild beasts of Nainawa eat me if I were to go and leave you, oh my master. No way would I ever leave." Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam said, "Jazakumullah khair, barakallahu feekum. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. Go back to your companions. Don't worry about it. I'm going to be okay." And as Nafi' is going back toward the tent, Lady Zainab alayhi salam, she exits the tent. And she goes toward Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam and says, "Oh, Abu Abdullah, as for Banu Hashim, I know of their loyalty to you. As for my brother Abbas, I know of his courage and his bravery, and I know that he is going to be there to defend you. But oh, Abu Abdullah, for your companions, are you sure that they are going to be loyal?" And at this moment, you know what happens? Nafi' bin Hilal, he overhears that conversation between Zainab and Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. So he rushes toward the tent of the companions, and he goes towards Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, and he goes to Habib ibn Madahir, who was sharpening his sword, getting ready for battle the next day. And he says, "Oh Habib, oh Zuhair, when I was walking out, I heard Zainab questioning our loyalty and questioning our courage and questioning our bravery." You know what the report states? It says that the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, they all took their swords and they rushed out like lions in front of the tent of Zainab, holding up their swords, calling out, "Labbayk ya Zainab. Oh Zainab, here we are at your service. We swear by your brother and we swear by your father and we swear by your mother Az-Zahra that we will never leave your brother Abu Abdullah. We are loyal and we will remain loyal to him." And one by one, the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, they demonstrate their loyalty to Imam al-Hussein. Habib ibn Madahir al-Asadi, he says, "Oh Abu Abdullah, I will fight and I will fight and I will fight until they kill me and until they shed my blood." At that moment, Zuhair ibn al-Qayn stands up holding his sword. He calls out, "Oh Abu Abdullah, if they take my body and they kill me and I'm resurrected 1,000 times for you, oh Abu Abdullah, I will give my life." And one by one, all of the companions of Imam al-Hussein, so that Zainab alayhi salam can hear. They pledge their loyalty to Imam al-Hussein salam. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu salam, he tells them to please go back into the tent. He thanks them greatly. And in a few hours, we know that none of those companions remained. And that Abu Abdullah al-Hussein was all alone. It is said that in addition, on the night of Ashura, Imam al-Hussein with Abu al-Fadl Abbas, he built a ditch around the tents of Imam al-Hussein of Lady Zainab, of the women, of the children, of the companions, along with Abu al-Abbas, along with Ali al-Akbar, along with other members of Banu Hashim and other members of the companions of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi. They all built this ditch and they put wood in it. And in the morning of that day, they would light it with fire for one reason. And that was to protect the caravan, the tents of Lady Zainab and of Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam from being looted. Because Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam had a feeling that this was going to happen. He knew what was going to happen the very next day. But I ask you, O Abu Abdullah, where was that ditch and where was that fire in terms of protecting your women and children only 24 hours from? Let's go to the day of Ashura, my dear sisters and brothers. And the night of Ashura passed, the morning of the Fajr prayers, and the adhan was called out, and one by one the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, they dedicated themselves toward their master Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. And as we've been narrating over the last several nights, all of those companions who were loyal, they gave their life in the way of Abu Abdullah. Muslim ibn Awsaja and John and Wahab and Habib ibn Madahar, Zuhair ibn Qayn, and Abu Thalama al-Sa'idi, one by one, all of these incredible companions, they gave their life in the way of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. And then one by one, the children of Aqil, they gave their life in the way of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam's brothers, one by one, Abu al-Fadl Abbas and his brothers, they went out and they fought valiantly until they were killed in the way of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. The children of Imam al-Hasan salamullah alayhi, that of Qasim and that of Abdullah, they went out and they fought valiantly until they were also killed by Imam al-Hussein, by the enemy of Umar bin Sa'ad, one by one, in dedication and in loyalty, until no one was left remaining. So Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he goes into the tent and he looks toward Lady Zainab alayhi salam and he says, "Oh my sister Zainab, give me the cloak of battle, give me my shield and give me my armor and give me my sword. But for tonight, my dear sisters and brothers, I will narrate to you the tragedy as narrated by Karbala ibn Kahil himself, and we'll save the details for tomorrow. When Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, he catches Karbala ibn Kahil, that man who is known for striking those specific arrows at the tent and at the caravan of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam on the 10th of Muharram. Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, he says, "Oh Karbala, tell me, what did you do on the 10th of Muharram? Tell me what you did on the day of Ashura." You know what he said? He says, "Oh Mukhtar, I shot 7 arrows on the day of Ashura, 3 of them which missed their target and 4 of them which struck their target." He says, "Tell me, what are those arrows which struck their target?" He said, "One of those arrows was the arrow that struck the chest of Abdullah ibn Hassan, the son of Imam al-Hassan, the brother of Qasim. He was a young boy. He came out in the middle of the battle calling out to the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad, saying, 'Are you really going to kill my uncle? I don't have a father. Don't kill my uncle, you wicked people.' And at that moment, Umar ibn Sa'ad looked toward me and he said, 'Oh Harbala, strike this boy.' And I struck Abdullah ibn Hassan in the chest, and he fell on the lap of his father, fell on the lap of his uncle Abu Abdullah." He says, "What was that second arrow that you struck, O Harbala?" He said, "That second arrow that I struck, O Mukhtar, on the 10th of Muharram, was that arrow that pierced the right eye of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. After his right arm had been severed and after his left arm had been severed, he was rushing to bring back water toward the thirsty children of Hussein. when all of a sudden I saw the whiteness in the eye, and I took my arrow, it pierced the right eye of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. And then at that moment, another man came and struck him with an iron rod at his forehead. Normally, when a man falls down from his horse, he has his hands to protect him. But Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas didn't have any hands, so he fell flat on his face. He said, then at that moment, tell me, oh Harmala, what was the third arrow that you struck on the 10th of Muharram? He says, the third arrow that I struck on the 10th of Muharram, that was the one that was a bit painful for me. He says, tell me what happened. He said, I saw Hussein alayhi salam walk into the tent of Zainab. He calls out, Nawinini waladi ar-Rabi. Give me my child, give me the 6-month-old infant. Zainab alayhi salam says, oh Aba Abdullah, this child is thirsty. Go and see if the army of Amr ibn Sa'd has a little bit of mercy that they can espouse on this child. So it is said that at this moment, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he begins to walk closer and closer toward the middle of the plains of Karbala. And at that moment he calls out, O army of Amr ibn Sa'd, if you have a problem with me, then kill me. You have killed my companions. You have killed my family members. You have killed my children. He raises this child and he calls out, وَمَا ذَنْبٌ هَذَا الرَّضِيعُ. But what is the sin of this 6-month-old infant? At that moment, Umar ibn Sa'd says, Oh Karbala, to kill this child. And at this moment, he says that I looked at Umar ibn Sa'd and I said, should I kill the child or should I kill the father? And at this moment, perhaps the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, they began to wonder, this is just a child, should we kill him? This is Hussein, the grandson of the Messenger of God. He speaks some truth. And at this moment, in order to remove all of the confusion in the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, he says, Oh Hurmala, go and pierce that arrow, go and pierce that neck. So at this moment, it is said that Hurmala ibn Kahil, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, he strikes an arrow and it pierces through the neck of the child of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. The thirsty child, Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, doesn't know what to do. Blood begins to gush out of his neck. He covers the child with a cloak. He looks up at the sky, calling out, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. It suffices to me, oh Allah, that you saw everything that happened. But I ask you this, my dear friends, we'll go into details tomorrow. I ask you this, can you imagine what Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam had to endure when just thinking about how he's going to bring this child back to his mother Rabah? So it is said that he walks back and forth calling out, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Calling out, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Again, I'll save the details for tomorrow, but I'll tell you this, that at this moment, Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, he asked Harmala, he said, Oh Harmala, you said that you struck 4 arrows which hit their target. You only mentioned 3. What is the 4th arrow? He said, the 4th arrow was the one that I struck at the chest of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He said, I took a 3-pronged arrow that is used to kill camels in the middle of the desert. Camels, my dear friends, they hold water in the desert. And it's important to strike them with a 3-pronged arrow because of how heavy they are, because of how large they are. But I tell you, Abu Abdullah al-Hussein didn't have any water in his body. That Abu Abdullah al-Hussein died thirsty. So it is said that at that moment, on the 10th of Muharram, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, some man came and he took a rock which struck the forehead of Imam al-Hussein. So he lifted his cloak in order to wipe off the blood. I saw the chest of Hussein. At that moment, I took this arrow and it struck the chest of Imam al-Hussein on the 10th of Muharram. Only a few moments later, Hussein falls down from his horse. And only in a few hours, my dear sisters and brothers, Shamar bin al-Jawshan will be sitting on his chest. لا لا والله لا راجع ولا لعنة الله على الأمر